Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. My name is Garrett, and this happened when I was a sophomore in college. After freshman year, I didn't get a dorm, so I had to scramble for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op that was part of a 3-house community. It wasn't exactly close to campus, but it was cheap. And since I had a bike, I didn't mind the extra travel time. Most of the residents were young students like me, though there were some exceptions: alumni, a couple of TAs, and a few older people who had gone back to school later in life. But the person who stood out to me immediately was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses. She looked like she was in her late 50s, though her graying hair and the limp in her walk made her seem even older. She rarely spoke, kept to herself, and always wore a blank expression. I assumed she had some connection to the university, maybe faculty, maybe an alum, but nobody explained and I didn't ask. The first time she did something strange was in the common kitchen. The other 2 houses had their own kitchens, so I didn't understand why she was in ours. She wasn't cooking, eating, or even speaking. She was just standing there while the rest of us cooked, talked, and listened to music. She didn't try to join in. She only stood still, staring blankly. A few times I caught her eyes, and it felt like she was watching me specifically. Nobody else acknowledged her, which made it even weirder. Maybe they knew something I didn't. Later that week, I saw her again. I was doing homework in my room when I glanced out the window, and there she was, standing in the middle of the street, staring up at my window. It was late and cold, and she wasn't even on the sidewalk. I couldn't tell if she was looking directly into my room or just at the house in general, but it felt like her gaze was locked on me. For some reason, I waved at her, trying to be polite. The instant I did, I regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped up and down like a child, then suddenly ran off toward one of the other houses, presumably hers. That's when the sinking realization hit me. Not only had she been staring into my room, but now she knew exactly which room was mine. That night I asked one of my housemates about her. He told me she'd always been there and that I should just ignore her like everyone else did. When I pressed for more, he admitted he didn't know anything, just what someone had told him when he moved in. Unsatisfied, I kept asking around until one of the seniors in her house finally gave me an answer. He said she was affiliated with the university, a little kooky, but had no history of violence. When I asked why no one found her behavior strange, he told me they couldn't really control who lived there because the property manager made those decisions. That explanation didn't settle my nerves, but there wasn't much I could do. So I tried to put her out of my mind. But things only got worse. One night I opened my door past midnight and nearly ran into her. She was standing directly in front of my room. I literally jumped back, heart pounding. She didn't say a word, didn't even react. She just turned and slowly walked away, as if I was the one intruding on her. After that, there were more encounters. I'd find her snooping around places she had no business being, doing things that made no sense. Around that time, I lost my room key. All 3 houses had once been part of the same hotel, so each room had a lock and key. A lot of people didn't bother locking their doors, but I couldn't sleep unless mine was locked. Losing the key was a huge deal. I had a spare, but it meant I'd have to get another copy made, something I couldn't quite afford to deal with just then. A few nights later, I woke up for no reason. At first I thought it was just restlessness, but then I heard it. A soft bumping sound coming from my closet every 20 seconds or so. It was faint, like something shifting inside. My heart began to race. I'm not the kind of person to freeze up in a dangerous situation. I was determined to handle it myself. Slowly, I climbed out of bed and walked toward the closet, steadying my breathing. In one quick motion, I ripped the door open and screamed to startle whoever or whatever was inside. And just as I feared, she was there. The woman stood in my closet, one of my ties wrapped around her neck, eyes wide and unblinking. In her other hand, she clutched a kitchen knife. My scream startled her, and she immediately lunged at me, thrusting the knife forward. This time my scream wasn't an act, it was pure terror. I fought her off, wrestling her to the ground. She was frail, so I managed to disarm her quickly, but the struggle was terrifying. She kicked, clawed, and even bit as I pinned her down, shrieking the entire time. I yelled for help, and doors flew open down the hall. My friend Lee rushed over and helped me restrain her while another housemate called the police. The rest of the night blurred together. The cops arrived quickly, arrested her on the spot, and searched her. That's when they found my missing room key in her pocket. A few weeks later, we learned the truth. She was the property manager's sister. She had severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her help, he had secretly let her live in one of the empty rooms. Eventually, he was arrested for negligence and other charges, and rightfully so. To this day, I blame him far more than I blame her. I almost feel sorry for her, but pity doesn't erase the fact that she tried to kill me. I could have lost my life that night. I'll never understand why she fixated on me, and I can only hope I never experience anything like that again. I'm graduating soon, and though I'll miss college, I know that when I look back on these years, that night will always haunt me. This isn't exactly my story, but I essentially watched the whole thing happen, so I'm going to tell it anyway. Ivy lived in a modest 2-story home with my husband Benjamin for the better part of 20 years. All of our kids are grown now and living their own lives, and I couldn't be prouder. Last year, though, something happened across the street that I'll never forget. For a long time, the house across from ours sat vacant. I was sick of staring at an empty place every day, so when someone finally moved in, it felt like a relief. I'm retired, which means I spend a lot of time on my front porch, knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with Benjamin, listening to true crime podcasts, or just playing some music. The new neighbor was a young man, maybe in his mid-20s. He drove a flashy BMW and dressed in expensive-looking clothes, so I figured he was either well off or just pretending. But despite the showy appearance, he turned out to be sweet. After a few days, he came over and introduced himself. His name was Quinn, and like I suspected, he was just a few years out of college. He was bright, polite, and quickly struck up a friendship with Benjamin. The two of them laughed, swapped college stories, and even talked stocks and investments. Quinn said he worked in the entertainment industry, something about freelance work for an internet personality. Honestly, it went over my head, but it seemed lucrative enough. He certainly looked wealthy. Overall, he came across as a genuinely nice guy. For the next few months, life was normal. I saw him often, and he'd wave at me when leaving his house. I always waved back. But then, I noticed something new. A young woman started showing up at his place every so often. She drove a little white convertible and looked to be in her early 20s. Blonde, dressed rather scandalously. The kind of girl you'd expect someone like him to date. She had her own house key, which made sense if she was his girlfriend. She'd stop by once, sometimes twice a week, usually when Quinn wasn't home. She'd stay for a while and then leave. One evening, I finally saw them together. Quinn pulled into his driveway with her in the passenger seat, confirming what I already suspected. She was his girlfriend. But not long after that, things got tense. One afternoon, while tending to my garden, I heard shouting across the street. Quinn and the girl were in his driveway, yelling at each other. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. Her body language said it all. She was waving her arms wildly, her face red with anger. At one point, I thought she might strike him. Finally, she slammed into her car, peeled out of the driveway, and roared down the street. Quinn shook his head and went inside, not even noticing me watching. I assumed it was a lover's spat, couples fight. It wasn't my place to get involved. But then her car kept showing up, again and again, when Quinn wasn't home. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. I mentioned it to Benjamin, but he told me not to pry, that I should leave the boy alone. So I tried. Then came the night everything fell apart. Benjamin and I were asleep when sirens jolted us awake. We rushed outside along with several neighbors. Quinn's house was surrounded by police cars and an ambulance. We stood frozen as officers led the girl, Ellie, we later learned, out of the house in handcuffs. She didn't resist or scream. She just stared straight ahead with a blank expression. Moments later, paramedics wheeled Quinn out on a stretcher. My stomach dropped. He was covered in blood, his face pale, his clothes stained red. I gasped out loud. We didn't see him for a week after that, and I was sick with worry. When he finally came home, Benjamin and I walked over to check on him. He let us in and told us everything. Her name was Ellie. She had confessed right away, which made things easy for the police. But the truth was horrifying. For starters, she wasn't supposed to have his house key. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without his knowledge. She had been demanding more and more from him. Fancy dinners, jewelry, expensive trips. When he hesitated, she became possessive and angry. That's when the relationship began spiraling out of control. Worse yet, Quinn found out she had been tracking his location through his phone. She had gone through all his personal belongings. And most disturbing of all, she had planted hidden cameras in his bedroom. Every time she showed up at his house while he wasn't home, she was replacing the camera batteries and making sure they were still working. The argument I overheard in the driveway? That was Quinn trying to break up with her. She refused, so he reluctantly agreed to a break. But Ellie had already seen everything through those hidden cameras. The very next night, she showed up at his house with a knife. I won't go into the gruesome details, but she attacked him. He barely fought her off and managed to get outside, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctor later said he was only an inch away from needing surgery, or dying. Benjamin and I did our best to comfort him, but Quinn was visibly shaken. The last thing he told us before we left that day was that he had learned his lesson. Never flaunt money, especially around pretty girls. Not long after he moved away, he said he no longer felt safe in that house. Ellie had too many friends just like her, and the thought that they knew where he lived terrified him. We never saw him again. To this day, I pray he's okay. No one that young should ever have to endure something so terrifying. When I moved into my new place, I was just looking for a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let us just say a bad situation with an ex had made staying in my old city impossible. I'd run into some money early in life and made some bad choices about the kind of women I surrounded myself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I moved to was exactly what I needed. Low crime, quiet, mostly families. The houses were all spaced out with generous yards, which was part of the appeal for me. But for some reason, the property next to mine sat much closer than any of the other houses, almost uncomfortably close. And that house next door? It was huge. When I first saw it, I thought it could easily fit a family of 10, grandparents and all. That's honestly what I assumed at first, a big family lived there. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Even though I was trying to keep a low profile, I didn't want to be rude. I decided to introduce myself to everyone in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, I saved my next-door neighbor for last. I couldn't tell you why. Everyone else I met seemed genuinely sweet. 90% were parents of young children, and all of them were slightly intimidating simply because of how successful they seemed. As a younger single guy in his late 20s, I wasn't sure how easily I'd blend into a community like that, but that was more of a personal insecurity than anything else. By the time I got around to meeting my next-door neighbor, my social battery was nearly dead. But I knew if I didn't do it now, I might never work up the motivation again. So I just sucked it up and walked up their driveway. I'd gotten used to being greeted by middle-aged people, so when a young guy with a mullet opened the door, I was a little taken aback. He looked even younger than me, which shocked me. I recovered quickly and launched into my new-to-the-neighborhood spiel. Before I could even finish, he flashed a massive smile and cut me off. "Oh, wow," he said. "Someone who was born in my decade. What a nice surprise." I laughed and told him I felt the same way. I even vented a little about how out of place I felt as a single guy in his late 20s among so many families with kids. He reassured me not to worry and said most of the people who lived here kept to themselves. That was kind of a relief to hear. He introduced himself as Damon and told me I should come by for a drink sometime. Half-jokingly, I shrugged and said, "Hell, why not right now?" I expected him to laugh and invite me in. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder into his living room, scanning it almost nervously, then turned back to me. He said he wished he could, but was busy working. I asked what he did for work, just a normal follow-up question, and he dropped his smile for a moment. After a weird stare, he laughed lightly and just said finance on without elaborating. I thought that was a bit strange, but didn't push it. I asked if he had any roommates. To my surprise, he said he lived there alone. That floored me. His house was massive, far bigger than mine, and yet he was living there solo. We chit-chatted for a few more minutes before he gave me his number and went back inside. I was excited someone my age lived next door. He seemed chill, but I couldn't get over how odd it was for a guy like that to live alone in such a huge place. Sure, I was doing something similar, but my house wasn't even half the size of his. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful happened. I texted Damon a few days later to set something up, but he always complained about being busy and apologized that we couldn't hang out. Eventually, I gave up. Not in a hostile way, but in a you do you kind of way. I'm not the type to bend over backwards for someone who seems disinterested. I never saw anyone coming or going from Damon's place. No visitors, no parties, no girls, nothing. He didn't even get takeout delivered, which was strange because his car was always in the driveway. I genuinely didn't know what he ate because I never saw him leave the house. The guy lived like a ghost. I work from home, and my office is on the 3rd floor overlooking Damon's property. That's how I noticed his habits. I know it sounds obsessive and a little creepy, but his house was just a glance away from my monitor, so I couldn't help but look over from time to time. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Wednesday, I remember that distinctly. Around 2:01 a.m. I woke up to loud music. I sleep with my windows open, so that's probably how I heard it so easily. At first, I thought I was imagining it or dreaming, but I wasn't. I got out of bed and peeked out my window. There they were, 7 or so cars lined up in Damon's driveway. He was having a party. Now, I'm not the type to complain about noise. I've been to my fair share of house parties, but this was the middle of the week and the volume was insane. I figured I'd just go over, knock, and ask him to turn it down. I threw on a hoodie and walked over. From outside it was obvious, a full-blown party. I knocked, but no one answered. I pulled out my phone to text Damon but decided against it, knowing he'd probably ignore me and give me some BS excuse the next day. I knocked harder. Still nothing. I reached for the handle, fully expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door swung open. Inside, the first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs. But something was off. There was literally no one inside. I moved further in, expecting to see people in the living room or kitchen, but the place was completely empty. No drinks left out, no trash, nothing. Yet I could still hear the sounds of people. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. That's when it hit me. It wasn't real music at all. It was a recording, a literal recording of a party. But that didn't make sense. It didn't explain the cars or the shoes. There were people in that house somewhere. That much I was sure of. I should have turned around right then, but I needed to know what was going on. I moved quietly through the house until I saw a door slightly ajar. I gently pushed it open. It led down to the basement. I don't know how I knew, but something told me what I was looking for was downstairs. The stairwell was dark except for a faint light coming from somewhere below. I knew there was no reason to go down there, but I did anyway. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw the light coming from another door deeper in the basement. As I crept closer, I started to hear another sound beneath the music, something mechanical, a heavy rhythmic grinding, like machinery or a buzzsaw. I moved closer until I could see through the crack in the door. Inside were 3 men, much older than Damon. They were standing across the room, staring at something I couldn't see. They wore heavy-duty work clothes, protective goggles, thick rubber gloves, and work boots, the same boots I'd noticed earlier in the pile of shoes. Under different circumstances, I might have assumed they were construction workers. I wanted to see what they were looking at, but it was out of view. After a few seconds, the smell hit me. Bleach or some kind of strong cleaning solution. That's what did it. My stomach dropped. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I turned, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I made my way back toward the stairs, the light behind me suddenly dimmed, like someone had closed the door. I didn't hear it over the music, but I felt it. I bolted up the stairs, ran through the house, and burst out the front door. I didn't run directly to my house. Instead, I jumped my fence and slipped into my backyard. entering through my side door and locking it behind me. My chest was pounding. Under no circumstances could I let Damon, or whoever those men were, know it was me snooping around. I went up to my office, turned off all the lights, crouched under the window, and peeked out at Damon's house. At first, nothing. Then, a few minutes later, the front door flew open and about 8 men poured out, scanning the yard, the driveway, and the street. Damon wasn't with them. They all looked older, like the men I'd seen in the basement. Some of them were arguing. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but one man shoved another like they were about to fight. Eventually, they went back inside, and the music stopped. I stayed at the window trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? The music had stopped, and there was no obvious crime to report. I also couldn't understand why none of my other neighbors had called the police. Most of them had children. Surely they'd heard the noise. And the shoes. The pile of shoes I'd seen didn't to match the boots the men were wearing. Did they bring extra shoes just to leave them there? I had too many questions and no answers. Eventually, I just went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and looked out my window. Every single car was gone, including Damon's. Days passed. Damon still didn't return, or at least his car didn't. With each passing day, my confusion grew. I started asking my neighbors directly if they'd heard the party. No one knew what I was talking about. Even when I told them which house it was coming from and how late it was, they looked at me like I was crazy. That was a few months ago. Now Damon's house sits untouched. The grass is overgrown. A pile of packages leans against the front door. No one is maintaining it. I don't know what to make of any of it. It could be nothing. But why go to such lengths to fake a party unless something illegal was happening? And if they were so careful, how could they forget something as basic as locking the front door? Maybe that's what those men were arguing about. I have no idea. The fact that none of my other neighbors seemed bothered by that night makes me feel like I am part of some huge conspiracy. I know I'm probably just being paranoid, but I still have so many unanswered questions. If Damon ever comes back, I'm debating whether to just walk over and straight up ask him.